literature and understanding. The arguments and examples of the last two sections have been intended to show that the literary devices of poetry and the novel can be used to create images which oblige us to view our experience in certain ways and thus illuminate aspects of it. It is this possibility, perhaps relatively rarely realized, that allows us to describe imaginative literature as a source of understanding, and which entitles us to attribute considerable importance to it. This claim can be misinterpreted, so it needs to be emphasized that what we have been discussing are possibilities. It is not the purpose of a normative theory of art to discover the definitive characteristic that makes all art art. Its purpose is to identify the different ways in which art can be of value and assess the relative importance that we should attach to its various manifestations. As a normative theory applied to the literary arts, aesthetic cognitivism should not be taken to imply that all imaginative literature must enrich human understanding, or that it is commonly valued on these grounds. Probably the majority of poems and stories are valued because they are amusing, delightful, absorbing, or interesting. These are important values. A life devoid of delight and amusement is an impoverished one. At the same time, a life that never rises much above delightful and amusing experiences is limited. It is the fact that the works of Shakespeare, Donne, Austen, Dickens, Racine, Goethe, Cervantes, Tolstoy, and so on offer us more than this that both explains and justifies us in regarding them as we do. For in the most celebrated imaginative literature, the devices of poetry, story, and drama are harnessed not just to please and entertain, but to create images, character, scenes, events, ideas, through which the reader's apprehension of human nature and the human condition is enhanced. Literature, at its best, gives us a deeper understanding of what it is to have a life, and it is the fact that it can play this role, though it need not and does not always, that gives us reason to value it so highly. But the greatest literary masterpieces, along with the masterpieces of the other arts, can go beyond enabling us to reflect upon our social and moral experience. They actually create the world of that experience for us by fashioning master images that become paradigms for thought and conduct. One such paradigm is that of Shakespeare's Othello. Othello is the image of destructive jealousy. Another is Herman Melville's Billy Budd, with Budd himself a paradigm of fatally vulnerable innocence. Other arts also provide even more striking instances of the master image as paradigm. Here's one example from film. The Russian Revolution is an event which played an important part in the conduct of Soviet life and in its relations with the rest of the world for almost 70 years. Yet, the Russian Revolution that played this role is not the event historians investigate, and its political significance is only loosely based on historical realities. What influenced subsequent history through the minds of its participants was an image of the Russian Revolution, the most powerful version of which is to be found in Eisenstein's film Battleship Potemkin. In a famous scene, the proletarian crowd storms the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. The crowd confronts enormous, ornate doors, symbols of power and wealth, and finally manages to force them open as a mighty act of combined strength. Their solidarity has made them invincible. As far as history goes, no such event ever took place. This is not how the past actually was, but how it had to be in order to sustain the idea of a world-shattering revolution with all the political significance that it had. In creating this fine film, Eisenstein was not engaged in servile propaganda. No doubt he created his image and ignorance. He created his image in ignorance of the real history of events, an ignorance no greater than most people at the time, it should be said. His gift was to know the mentality of the times, but to do more than this as well. He supplied the times with a lasting image. Henceforth, the October Revolution, out of which the Soviet Union was born, and to the defense of which future policy was supposed to be directed, was not the history of 1917, about which the leaders and people of the former Soviet Union knew relatively little, but this image from Battleship Potemkin. The people, overwhelmingly the best defenses of Tsarist Russia, is an artistic image that did not merely reflect but structured the world of political experience. Art can have the same sort of relation to moral and social experience. A useful distinction to draw upon here is that between stereotypes and archetypes. The master images of the greatest artists are not to be understood as distillations or summations of the variety in experience stereotypes, but imaginary paradigms against which we measure that variety, archetypes. And in certain contexts, these archetypes may be said to constitute the only reality that there is. Such things as a lover or a gentleman or the perfect marriage or a consuming passion or innocence do not await our discovery in the way that black swans or seams of gold do. They are patterns which structure our approach to the social and moral world in which our lives have to be lived, and determine our attitudes to the behavior of ourselves and others. Works of art that come to have a common currency contribute to the formation of these patterns, and in the case of the greatest works, they have been definitive. Art thus contributes to social and moral experience, and for this reason may be said to provide us with the possibility not only of understanding but of self-understanding. Take, for example, the relationship between two people who might be or become lovers. How are they to think of the relationship it would be good to form, and the sort of human pitfalls that lie in their way? Every relationship has an external and an internal aspect, and the internal is rarely on view. In the works of imaginative artists, and this division is surmountable. Fiction and poetry put both mind and action equally on view. Characters and events can be seen entire. Novels and poems supply patterns of human relationship, its fulfillment, destruction, or corruption. And these can enter directly into the moral experience of those who are reflecting upon how best to live, because the devices of art reveal to us the internal, how it feels, as well as the external, how it is. In fulfilling this function, literature is especially important because it is especially powerful. Music, as we saw in chapter 5, can structure our oral experience. Visual art can do the same for visual experience, and as I argued in the previous chapter, can to some extent go beyond the purely visual. A painting or a sculpture can certainly reveal something of the personality, as well as the appearance of a figure represented. See, for instance, the mentalities revealed by the faces in Caravaggio's beheading of John the Baptist. But literature can create and explore inner lives to a far greater extent. It is in literature, poems, novels, plays, that our self-images are fashioned with the greatest complexity, and where exploration of the constitutive images of moral and social life is most obvious. This is one of literature's peculiar powers and gives it, in this respect, preeminence among the arts. Summary: this chapter has addressed the difficulties that lie in the way of applying the theory of aesthetic cognitivism to imaginative literature. These difficulties arise chiefly because it is natural to think that any cognitive element in poetry or novels, what there is to be learned from them, is in what they say and not in the form in which they say it. Yet, if the form of a poem or a novel is not central to its assessment as an artistic achievement, it would appear to follow that literary art cannot amount to more than embroidery and embellishment, to use John Locke's terms, and that paraphrase can replace poetry without significant loss of meaning. However, closer examination has shown that form and content in literature are often impossible to disentangle, and that a variety of poetic and literary devices can be integrally employed in the creation of imaginative literature, which prompts us to see and think about our experience of life differently. It is this power that gives literature its cognitive value. It is not obviously true that such a power is possessed by all art forms. In addition to those already examined, there is another for which the case seems especially hard to make, namely architecture. This requires a chapter to itself. But before that, we should consider the performing arts, in which the musical and the visual and the literary all combine. Chapter 8, the performing arts. In chapter 5, we explored the nature of music and ended the chapter by noting that no special account had been taken of the fact that music is a performing art. In this chapter, that omission is to be remedied. But since music is only one of the performing arts, the best way to do so is to consider the performing arts in general and re-examine music alongside dance and drama. Artist, audience, and performer. Why do the performing arts need a chapter to themselves? What is so special about them? Are they not just other sources of pleasure, beauty, and imaginative insight? The answer seems to be obvious. Yes, they are. Yet, we can note an important difference straight away. The plastic and literary arts involve a two-place relationship between artist and audience. On the one side is the painter, sculptor, novelist, or poet, and on the other, the viewer, spectator, or reader. As far as aesthetic engagement is concerned, artist and audience exhaust the possibilities. We are either one or the other, but the performing arts involve a three-place relationship. Works of music, dance, and theater may begin with the ideas and imagination of a composer, a choreographer, or a playwright, and the resulting work, the composition, the choreography, the drama, is generally intended for an audience. But it can only reach that audience by means of a third party, the player, the dancer, the actor. These performers are vital to realizing the work of art, literally making it exist. Because without them, the music would remain nothing more than the black marks on the score, the choreograph, a set of instructions about movement, and the script, a collection of unspoken sentences. Of course, the visual and literary arts require some sort of medium as well. Michelangelo needed marble to enable us to see the image of David that his genius had led him to imagine. Dickens needed print and paper to tell his readers the story of David Copperfield that he had invented. Jackson Pollock needed copious quantities of metallic paint for his action paintings. In this way, sculptors, novelists, and painters also rely upon other people to help them bring their artworks to reality. Michelangelo on the stone mason, Dickens on the printer, Pollock on the paint manufacturer. But there is an important difference. No one thinks the stone mason or the printer are themselves artists, since the stone with which the sculptor has been provided does not play any direct part in making the artwork what it is. And since the story of David Copperfield remains the same irrespective of the typeface used to print it or the paper it is printed on, in neither case does the medium add any artistic element of its own. True, it is the manufacturer who produced paint of precisely the color that is to be found in Pollock's painting, but Pollock who chose to put it there. The implication is that the people involved in supplying these media, essential though they are not themselves artists. Dickens needs the printer, but not in a way that makes the printer a sort of novelist. Precisely the opposite is true in the performing arts. the cellist Pablo Casals made a recording of Bach's cello suites that is widely regarded as perhaps their greatest performance. People continue to prefer it to more recent recordings because it is itself the work of a great artist. Similarly, audiences flocked to see Rudolf Nureyev's dance Swan Lake, and not merely to see Geltzer's choreography or even hear Tchaikovsky's music. Laurence Olivier's performance as Richard III was critically acclaimed quite independently of Shakespeare's great drama. In performing art, then, there are three aspects to be considered and not just two. From an artistic point of view, the performer matters as well as the artist and the audience. It is the crucial role of the player, the dancer, and the actor that marks off the performing arts from the plastic and literary arts, in which there is no equivalent. Pollock's action painting is misleadingly named if it ever inclines anyone to think that they could paint one of his paintings. Painting as the paradigm of art. Despite this rather obvious difference, there has been a strong tendency in aesthetics and the philosophy of the arts to try to conceptualize the performing arts as something like the plastic and the literary arts. This tendency has been sustained by the recurring desire amongst philosophers, art theorists, and even artists themselves to find a common property or feature that all the arts share. Something that will justify their being classified as art despite their evident differences. It is in this spirit that the painter Kandinsky declared, all the arts are identical. The difference between them manifests itself by the means of each particular art. Music expresses itself by sound, painting by colors, etc. This aspiration to find the thing that all arts have in common will be examined at greater length in chapter 12. For the moment, it is worth observing that one of the motives driving it is a concern with value and status. As we saw in chapter 1, anything that can claim the title art is generally accorded a higher cultural status than diversions classed as amusements or entertainment. Just as reporters are ranked more highly than crossword setters by editors and readers, though both contribute something of value to a newspaper, so the concert hall is rated above the nightclub and Shakespeare above soap opera, even though all of them provide leisure time opportunities. But what is it that elevates something from the realms of entertainment to the realms of art? Perhaps previous chapters have considered several suggestions. The point to note here, however, is that in searching for an answer to this question, it has often been assumed that the great painters and sculptors provide the benchmark. That is why the word art is usually taken to mean painting and sculpture first and foremost, and applied to music or literature only by extension. The Oxford Dictionary of Art, for example, is almost exclusively concerned with painting and sculpture, while corresponding volumes for the other arts expressly specify music, literature, and architecture in their titles. This assumption that art first and foremost means painting is most evident whenever a doubt arises about artistic status. If, for instance, someone wonders whether dance is an art, a common approach to settling the issue is to see if it can, in some way or other, be modeled on painting. An interesting parallel to this way of thinking about value and significance is to be found in science. Science, like art, is an honorific term, one that bestows considerable status. But what is a science? Just as visual art is taken to be the paradigm case of art proper, so there is a tendency to regard physics as the paradigm or benchmark that other subjects must measure up to if they are to be classified as sciences. That is why, in past times, astrology, as opposed to astronomy, was declared unscientific, and more recently, why people have sometimes been led to question the scientific status of subjects such as psychology and sociology. When this is questioned, an onus falls on psychologists and sociologists to show that their inquiries are conducted along something like the same lines as physicists. Yet, to take physics as the paradigm of science can lead to gross distortion. Why should the study of the human mind or of human societies be like the study of particles and forces? How could it? Just to take one evident difference, human beings and human societies can learn from each other. Physical particles cannot. So, in explaining human and social behavior, we have to take account of factors, knowledge, and experience that have no place in explaining the behavior of particles. We all see how deeply mistaken it would be to try to explain the behavior of fundamental particles in terms of their knowledge and beliefs, hopes and fears. People have found it less easy to see that it is equally mistaken to try to explain the workings of the human mind in terms that exclude all these. What this tells us is that the scientific study of human beings and human societies has to be different, since taking physical science as our model would lead us unscientifically to ignore some crucial facts. Just as the philosophy of science needs to be aware of the dangers of making one science the model for all, so the philosophy of art needs to be alive to the possibility that taking painting or plastic art more generally to be the pattern for all the arts runs a similar risk of distortion. Consequently, we need to consider very carefully whether the idea that painting is the standard to which anything properly called an art must aspire can really accommodate the performing arts satisfactorily. Okay, so consequently, we need to consider very carefully whether the idea that painting is the standard to which anything properly called an art must aspire can really accommodate the performing arts satisfactorily. A major consequence of treating painting as a paradigm when considering the performing arts is that the principal focus of attention is not activity, playing, dancing, acting, but product. The composition, the choreograph, the play. Just as the outcome of the painter's activity is a picture, so we might think the result of the ballet dancer's activity is a performance, the realization of choreographed movement before an audience. In this way, painting and ballet are conceptualized as the same sort of thing. Both the picture and the performance are art objects that are presented for an audience to appreciate aesthetically. It is quite easy to conceive of music along these lines. We speak, after all, of music making, and might therefore focus our attention exclusively on what is made rather than the process of making it. If we do, music becomes a sort of painting in sound or sonic arts, to take another term from chapter 5. Conceived in this way, music appreciation is rather like viewing a painting, except that it is something we do with our ears rather than our eyes. In a similar fashion, it is possible to think of acting as a way of turning dialogue and stage directions into something perceptible on stage, so that the playwright's visualization becomes visible to the audience. In times past, it was precisely this way of thinking that inclined people to think that the arrival of film would put an end to theater, though as we saw in chapter 6, this fourth wall conception does not do justice to film as an art. Amongst the performing arts, it might seem least easy to construe dance as a kind of painting. Yet some of the major historical figures in the theory of dance, anxious to secure its status as an art, have enthusiastically advocated a conception of dance that interprets it as a painting in movement. The 18th century produced two celebrated advocates of this view, the Englishman John Weaver and the Frenchman Jean-Georges Noverre. Both were highly successful choreographers as well as dance theorists. And both thought that the best or highest form of dancing was an art in virtue of being a sort of painting or picturing. Noverre expressly makes the comparison with pictures and painting. A well-composed ballet is a living picture of the passions, manners, ceremonies, and customs of all nations of the globe. Like the art of painting, it exacts perfection. In taking this approach to dance, both Weaver and Noverre were thinking very much in accordance with an aesthetic common to most writers in the 18th century, and given its most influential exposition at the end of the century by Immanuel Kant in his Critique of Judgment, 1790. The Kantian aesthetic, as we saw in chapter 2, places great emphasis on the contemplation of beauty as the main focus of art. And a consequence of this is that the center of aesthetic attention must be a beautiful object. What is this object? In painting and sculpture, the answer is easy. The activity of the artist produces beautiful visual objects that we can contemplate and admire, namely painting and sculptures. But what could such aesthetic objects be in the case of performing arts? Music offers an obvious answer. Sonic objects, pieces of music, identifiable compositions, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, Grieg's Piano Concerto, Barber's Adagio for strings, etc. These are things to be heard rather than seen. Theatre, too, offers objects, namely plays like Shakespeare's Othello or Tom Stoppard's Jumpers. We can meaningfully raise questions about such entities without having to mention any particular performance of them. Have you heard Mahler's Fifth Symphony? Or have you seen Ibsen's Hedda Gabler? Are questions that make just as good sense as, have you seen the Mona Lisa? Dance is more difficult because in general we are rarely in a position to name individual choreographs. The most famous ballets tend to be associated with the composer of the music rather than the choreographer of the dance. Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker and Stravinsky's Rite of Spring are examples of this. Even so, We still think of these as the names of ballets rather than the names of pieces of music, things that have to be seen and not just heard. So it seems possible to identify dances as a further kind of aesthetic object without referring to any individual performance. Should we then think of the performing arts as a kind of painting in sound, in movement, in theatrical action? It is worth emphasizing that the motive for doing so on the part of Weaver and Noverre was normative, not descriptive. Their intention was not merely to characterize dancing, because the word dancing includes everything from barn dance through ballroom to disco. Rather, they meant to pick out and recommend a kind of stylized dancing that could take its place alongside painting and poetry as one of the fine arts. Their recommendation reflected and probably contributed to a widespread movement out of which ballet arose. Ballet, in contrast to barn dance, came to be regarded as having special artistic status. This view of dancing has prevailed. The art of dance is distinguished from social dancing. And when people claim that dance is an art no less than painting, it is ballet, not barn dance, that they have in mind. We can find something similar in the way people think about music. Like dancing, music covers a wide variety of phenomena. Folk singers, church choirs, symphony orchestras, jazz pianists, brass bands, pop and rock groups are only part of this variety. But when people speak of music as an art, they generally have in mind just one of these. The music commonly called classical, but better referred to as the music of the concert hall. It takes a special effort to remember that the practice of sitting down and giving exclusive attention to a piece of music is relatively new in human history, and it is still relatively rare. Music occupies a large place in every culture, but most of it is not the music of the concert hall, and many cultures have no equivalent of the concert hall. Even in the modern Western world, music is far from frequently heard on other occasions than in classical concerts. Very often, as an accompaniment to something else, the soundtrack to a film or television program, the organ during a church service, the military band at a public ceremony, or just as background in a shop or restaurant. Why then Do musicologists and philosophers of music tend to take the music of the concert hall as the principal form of music as art? Once more, the answer lies with the aesthetic ideals of the 18th century, which was, in fact, the period when concert halls devoted exclusively to music began to be built across Europe. Concert hall music fits the paradigm of the visual arts, or seems to. In the concert hall, an aesthetically aware audience attends to an art object, a symphony, a string quartet, a piano concerto, in the way that paintings are attended to in a gallery. It is not difficult, therefore, to think of the music as a kind of painting in sound, and indeed, it is not unusual to find program notes referring to the colors of the orchestration or the instruments. But the same conception is difficult to apply to music in its other manifestations. The jazz pianist playing at a restaurant, the brass band leading the parade, the organist accompanying the church choir, the fiddler entertaining friends at home, are all musicians, and often very skilled ones. None of them fits the conception of painting in sound in the way that the composer writing for a concert audience does. Should this failure to fit prevent us from calling them artists, and if so, why? The question invites us to think again about the idea of painting as a paradigm for all the arts. Nietzsche and the birth of tragedy. The central feature of the paradigm we have just been examining is this: it seriously diminishes the role of the performer. The conception of music as painting and sound, for example, construes players of instruments as merely the means by which a composer reaches an audience. As such, they are not any more artistically significant than the paintbrush or the paint, which are also means. The point can be extended to dancers whom the painting and movement conception also treats as mere means by which choreographers bring their creations to their public. Even actors, if we think of them as simply making visible the playwright's play, become no different to puppets skillfully manipulated by the puppeteer. In all three cases, this implication is obviously mistaken. Musicians, dancers, and actors bring interpretive as well as technical skills and abilities to bear upon their performance. Like the composer and the choreographer and the playwright, they too are artists. Equally important is this fact: there cannot be a painting without a painter, but there can be dancing without a choreographer, just as there can be a music without a composer. In fact, musicians do not need an audience either, at least in the way that painters need other people to look at their paintings. An improvising jazz group is an instructive example. The musicians are not following any score and can be playing entirely for their own benefit. Yet, even without either composer or audience, the activity is properly called music making. The music that is made, however, is not an art object, the sonic equivalent of a painting. It is a performance. The music resides in the activity itself, not in its outcome. The paradigm of music is usually taken to be a nameable work by a famous composer played in a purpose-built concert hall. The Allegri playing Benjamin Britten's first string quartet in London's Wigmore Hall, say. But suppose we reject this model and take jazz improvisation as the paradigm of music instead. What difference would this make to an account of music as an art? In the first place, it would require us to identify and explain the aesthetic character of music quite differently from the aesthetic character of a plastic art like painting. If the jazz group is indeed the paradigmatic example of music, and if music is an art, it follows that in some of its manifestations, art is not located in objects at all, but in activities. Now, the essence of activity is not contemplation, but participation. This shifts the focus of attention entirely away from the presentation of an object to an audience, which no longer seems of any special relevance to understanding music as an art. In short, music is not a kind of painting and sound, and it is only if unwarrantedly we give special attention to instances such as the Allegri in the Wigmore Hall that we will be inclined to go on thinking so. It is this difference, or something like it, that the 19th century philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, 1844 to 1900, had in mind in his earliest work, The Birth of Tragedy. There are, he thought, two spirits at work in art. Unlike all those who seek to infer the arts from a single principle, the necessary spring of life for every work of art, I shall fix my gaze on those two artistic deities of the Greeks, Apollo and Dionysus. For me, they are the vivid and concrete representations of two worlds of art, utterly different in their deepest essence and their highest aims. It is a contrast, he goes on to describe as this tremendous opposition, this yawning abyss between the Apolline plastic arts and Dionysian music. The Apollonian manufactures dreamlike images in paintings, stories, and poems, images that intrigue and invite us, our passive contemplation. The Dionysian, by contrast, does not invite contemplation, but seeks to take possession of us. If we yield to its spirit, instead of simply sitting back and watching, we are caught up in activity. Though the language may strike modern ears as somewhat fanciful, it captures something true and important. Some of the arts offer us images that are worth contemplating. These images can be conceptual as well as visual, characters in novels, no less than portraits and paintings, but they all invite us to study them carefully by giving them our undivided attention. It is this feature that has led to the concept of a distinctively aesthetic attitude that was discussed in chapter 2. Other arts, however, offer us something quite different. The opportunity to participate in activities like playing and dancing. It is certainly true that one instance of art is that of the spectator in an art gallery, carefully contemplating paintings by great masters. But another, equally good instance is the musician who, with voice or instrument, joins in the harmony and rhythm of the choir or band. This is one reason why Nietzsche thinks that music obeys quite different aesthetic principles from the visual arts and cannot be measured according to the category of beauty. False aesthetic has grown used to demanding, on the basis of a concept of beauty that prevails in the world of the visual arts, that music should provide an effect similar to that of works in the visual arts, the arousal of pleasure in beautiful forms. This false aesthetic is the aesthetic of the 18th century, the aesthetic of Weaver and Noverre, the aesthetic of the concert hall. It is false because it is one-sided and takes a single type of art, painting, to be all of art. In this way, it distorts our understanding of the performing arts by trying to make them fit an alien model.